Most of your days, if you've been tracking your regular activity, you'll notice that most of your days are filled with pretty regular, mundane, ordinary type things. Things like, brushing your teeth and eating breakfast, having a shower, driving to work, mowing the lawn, watching TV, all those sort of things, right? Just regular, run-of-the-mill type of stuff. And most of our days are full of that stuff, right? It's just another day, pretty much doing the same thing you've done 100 times before. However, every once in a while, we have a different sort of a day that changes everything. Colson and Dana had one of those days yesterday. For those of you who didn't know, Colson and Dana got married yesterday. They got wed out at Camp Little Red, came back here for the reception. And for them, that was a day that's going to change everything. They probably don't know the full extent of how different life is going to be, but life has changed for them in that one day. John and Wendy, a week ago Saturday, they celebrated 45 years of marriage. And I'm sure they would testify that 45 years ago when they said I do, that was a day that changed everything. Now, of course, it's not just wedding days that change everything. Sometimes it's the day of the car accident, or the day of that little one being born, or the day that you started that new job, or the day you lost your job, or whatever it is, right? Sometimes there's that one day that just changes everything. Well, Joseph was about to have one of those days. When we last left Joseph, he was in the prison of the palace of the guard in Egypt. Now, sometime before this, he had been sold by his brothers into slavery. They took him down to Egypt, and he was bought by a guy named Potiphar, who was the captain of the guard. But his wife ended up telling some lies about him, falsely accusing him of a crime that he never committed, and he so got thrown into prison. However, as we heard about last week, the Lord was with Joseph even in the prison, and he caused everything Joseph did to succeed. And so Joseph quickly gained the trust of the prison keeper. And before too long, Joseph was put in charge of the entire prison. He was kind of to take care of all the prisoners that were there with him. Well, as it happened, Pharaoh had his chief cupbearer and his chief baker thrown into that same prison as Joseph was. And so Joseph was kind of in charge of taking care of these two guys. And one night, they had a dream. Both of them had a dream that had some important meaning, but they just didn't know what that meaning was. And so they happened to be noticed by Joseph, and Joseph asked them what's bothering them. And Joseph, through God, was able to interpret these dreams for them. And he told them that in 3 days, the chief baker, unfortunately, was going to be executed. He would have his body impaled on a pole, and the birds would eat his flesh. But the chief cupbearer, he would get his old job back, and he'd once again be the cupbearer to the king. And then as he's sharing that with these guys, Joseph also says this one thing to the cupbearer in Genesis chapter 40, verse 14. He says, "And please remember me and do me a favor when things go well for you. Mention me to Pharaoh so that he might let me out of this place. For I was kidnapped from my homeland, the land of the Hebrews, and now I'm here in prison, but I did nothing to deserve it." All right, it was probably a long shot for Joseph to hope for Pharaoh's help in that situation. But really, that was Joseph's only hope of ever getting out of that prison. Now, unfortunately, even though everything that Joseph predicted happened exactly as he said, Joseph's request to the cupbearer would be denied, because as we read a little bit further on in that chapter in verse 23, it says, Pharaoh's chief cupbearer, however, forgot all about Joseph, never giving him another thought. Talk about being ungrateful, right? He tells this guy, he interprets his dream for him, tells him, all right, your life is going to be spared. You're going to get your old job back. Just remember me, right? And so what does the guy do? He goes back to work for Pharaoh, and he immediately forgets completely about Joseph, never giving him another thought. And so that's where we left him off last week. Poor old Joseph, kidnapped from his homeland, sold as a slave, thrown into prison, and now completely forgotten about. And Joseph stayed in that prison for another 2 full years, until one day when something happened. Unbeknownst to Joseph, this would be a day that would change everything. And so we're going to pick up our story in Genesis chapter 41 today, starting at verse 1. It says, 2 full years later, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing on the bank of the Nile River. In his dream, he saw 7 fat, healthy cows come up out of the river and begin grazing in the marsh grass. Then he saw 7 more cows come up behind them from the Nile, but these were scrawny and thin. These cows stood beside the fat cows on the riverbank. Then the scrawny, thin cows ate the 7 healthy fat cows. At this point in the dream, Pharaoh woke up, but then he fell asleep again and had a second dream. This time, he saw 7 heads of grain, plump and beautiful, growing on a single stalk. Then 7 more heads of grain appeared, but these were shriveled and withered by the east wind. And these thin heads swallowed up the 7 plump, well-formed heads. Then Pharaoh woke up again and realized it was a dream. The next morning, Pharaoh was very disturbed by the dreams. So he called for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt. When Pharaoh told them his dreams, not one of them could tell him what they meant. Finally, the king's chief cupbearer spoke up. "Today I've been reminded of my failure," he told Pharaoh. "Some time ago, you were angry with the chief baker and me, and you imprisoned us in the palace of the captain of the guard. One night, the chief baker and I each had a dream, and each dream had its own meaning. There was a young Hebrew man with us in the prison who was a slave of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he told us what each of our dreams meant. And everything happened just as he predicted. I was restored to my position as cupbearer, and the chief baker was executed and impaled on a pole." Pharaoh sent for Joseph at once, and he was quickly brought from the prison. After he shaved and changed his clothes, he went in and stood before Pharaoh. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I had a dream the other night, and no one here can tell me what it means. But I have heard that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it." All right, now we're just going to pause here for a second just to kind of wrap our heads around this situation. Now, Joseph's been a slave in Egypt for about 13 years at this point. And he's been in prison for at least the last 2 years. We're not told exactly what the timeline is there. He could have been in there much more than that. But suddenly, he's pulled out of the prison, and he's told, make yourself presentable because you're going to appear before Pharaoh. And we don't really know if Joseph was told why he was going to appear before Pharaoh or not, but he would certainly soon find out. So there's Joseph now. He's standing before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh says to him, "I had a dream the other night, and I hear that you can tell me what my dream means." Now, if you were Joseph, how would you answer that question? Because remember here, a lot is riding on how Joseph answers this question. Because, if this is probably Joseph's one and only chance of ever getting out of that prison. If Joseph or if Pharaoh decides that, he has no use for Joseph, sends Joseph back to the prison, it is almost a guarantee that Joseph will spend the rest of his days rotting away in that prison. So if Joseph isn't able to interpret Pharaoh's dreams, it's pretty much game over for Joseph. And also, at that same note, I think Joseph would certainly want to be able to prove his value, his worth to Pharaoh. But if Joseph says that he can do it, but then he gets it wrong, that's going to be pretty much game over for Joseph as well, right? Pharaoh doesn't want to have somebody giving him false interpretations of this dream. And I'm not sure how much confidence Joseph would have had because, sure, he was able to interpret the baker and the chief cupbearer's dreams. But what about those dreams he had back when he was a kid? Remember those dreams about how all his family was going to be bowing down to him? Those certainly hadn't come through. So I wonder if Joseph maybe didn't have all that much confidence in himself. And actually, based on his reply in the next verse, I would say that seems to be very true. I don't think Joseph had that much confidence in himself. But he certainly had confidence in God. Look at how he replies to Pharaoh in verse 16. He says, "It is beyond my power to do this," Joseph replied, "but God can tell you what it means and set you at ease." Joseph didn't have confidence in himself, but he had incredible confidence in God. He knew that it was beyond his power to interpret these dreams, but he knew that God could do it. And this is such a good reminder for us, I think. We don't need to have more self-confidence. We need to have more God confidence. I happened to browse through on Amazon, and I found that there's an entire category on Amazon books dedicated to self-esteem. It's a subcategory of self-help, but there's an entire category based on self-esteem. And there are more than 10,000 books available in this self-esteem category. And many of them are bestsellers. I was actually surprised as I went through bestseller, bestseller, bestseller. So obviously there's a lot of people who are looking for ways to increase their self-confidence. But I'm not sure that we need more books on self-confidence. I think we maybe need to read the one book that helps us have God confidence. I think one of the reasons that God has recorded so many incredible stories in these scriptures is so that we can have God confidence. When you read through about how God, divides the Red Sea so Moses and the Israelites can cross through, or how he knocks down the walls of Jericho so Joshua can just march straight in, or you read about how God has the ravens bring food for Elijah in the middle of that drought. Stories like that can't help but increase your God confidence. You know, that's why we like to have people share their testimonies here in church every so often. Because when we hear how God's been at work in their life, how he's changed things and set up all their situations, you know, hearing that just builds and strengthens our God confidence. You know, God confidence is knowing that when we are unable, God is able. When we are weak, that's when God is strong. When we don't know the answer, God knows everything. You know, that's God confidence. And I think Paul was a man who learned to have God confidence. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9, he writes this: I am glad to boast about my weaknesses so that the power of Christ can work through me. That's why I take pleasure in my weaknesses and in the insults, hardships, persecutions, and troubles that I suffer for Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong. You know, Paul, like Joseph, he didn't put confidence in himself. He put his confidence in God, so much so that he could boast about his weaknesses. That seems really odd to us, right? But he knew that when he was weak, God would be strong. Paul even goes so far as to say that he took pleasure in his own weakness. You know, doesn't that strike you as being odd? Are you happy when you are unable? Right? Does it thrill you when you are weak? You know, it doesn't seem to thrill me all that much when I'm unable, when I'm weak, when I'm incapable. But yet, Paul takes pleasure in his weakness, in his own ability, in his own suffering, because that's exactly when the power of God could come through, could work through him. Paul had the joy knowing that God's strength would come out in his weakness. In fact, even in the book of Philippians, Paul writes this, and you've heard this verse before. He says, for I can do everything through Christ who gives me strength. You know, and that's absolutely true. When we feel incapable or unqualified, or we simply can't do whatever it is that needs to be done, that's okay. In fact, that's a good thing, because when we are weak, that's exactly when God has the opportunity to show us just how strong, just how able, just how qualified he is. Nothing is too hard for him, and because of that, we can do everything through Christ who gives us his strength. And I think Joseph would agree. You know, it was beyond Joseph's power to interpret these dreams, but he had absolute confidence that God could do it. So Joseph put his confidence in God, and as a result, Pharaoh put his confidence in Joseph. It says in verse 17, so Pharaoh told Joseph his dream. In my dream, he said, I was standing on the bank of the Nile River, and I saw 7 fat, healthy cows come up out of the river and begin grazing in the marsh grass. Then I saw 7 sick-looking cows, scrawny and thin, come up after them. I've never seen such sorry-looking animals in all the land of Egypt. These thin, scrawny cows ate the 7 fat cows, but afterwards you wouldn't have known it, for they were still as thin and scrawny as before. Then I woke up. In my dream, I also saw 7 heads of grain, full and beautiful, growing on a single stalk. Then 7 more heads of grain appeared, but these were blighted, shriveled, and withered by the east wind. And the shriveled heads swallowed the 7 healthy heads. I told these dreams to the magicians, but no one could tell me what they mean. Joseph responded, both of Pharaoh's dreams mean the same thing. God is telling Pharaoh in advance what he is about to do. The 7 healthy cows and the 7 healthy heads of grain both represent 7 years of prosperity. The 7 thin, scrawny cows that came up later and the 7 thin heads of grain, withered by the east wind, represent 7 years of famine. This will happen just as I have described it, for God has revealed to Pharaoh in advance what he is about to do. The next 7 years will be a period of great prosperity throughout the land of Egypt. But afterwards, there will be 7 years of famine so great that all the prosperity will be forgotten in Egypt. Famine will destroy the land. This famine will be so severe that even the memory of those good years will be erased. As for having 2 similar dreams, it means that these events have been decreed by God, and he will soon make them happen. Therefore, Pharaoh should find an intelligent and wise man and put him in charge over the entire land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh should appoint supervisors over the land and let them collect 1/5 of all the crops during the 7 good years. Have them gather all the food produced in the good years that are just ahead and bring it to Pharaoh's storehouses. Store it away and guard it so that there will be food in the cities. That way, there will be enough to eat when the 7 years of famine come to the land of Egypt. Otherwise, this famine will destroy the land. Now, there's probably a few things that we could talk about as we go through this passage, but here's what caught my attention as I read through this. Joseph mentions twice in these verses here that through these dreams, God was warning Pharaoh in advance of what God was about to do. In the near future, there's going to be this terrible famine, but God would send first the 7 great years of prosperity. There'd be all kinds of food. But then, after that, there'd be 7 years of terrible famine that would wipe out, basically, any gains made in those 7 years. And twice, Joseph says how these dreams are a warning to Pharaoh about what God was going to do. Now, of course, we probably can't even imagine any of our modern governments embracing such a message if they had one. No prime minister, no premier, no king, no governor would ever embrace a message like that they had a dream and it was God warning them of what God was going to do, right? Our modern Western culture is so secularized that we would never entertain the thought of God sending us a message of impending doom. We might listen to a meteorologist or a climate change scientist or something like that, but certainly not a message from God. But the reality is that God has given us, including our leaders, a very similar warning. Even though we may not be facing a tragic famine that's coming into the land or anything like that, our nation is facing a tragedy that is probably even more severe than this. God has warned us that when we stray from following his commands and his principles, when we refuse to live in obedience and submission to him, that destruction naturally follows. The Old Testament is filled with these kinds of warnings from God to the Israelites and to the surrounding nations. In our Sunday school class, we've been going through the book of Hosea, and really that's the key message, that the Israelites had been straying from God, they'd forgotten about him, and as a result, if they didn't change their ways, destruction was on the way. And I think that's probably true for Canada, too. It may not be tomorrow, but unless Canadians begin to change our ways and turn back to God, we are naturally on a course towards eventual destruction. God has warned us about this very clearly in his word. And so perhaps maybe even more pressing for us today than the state of our nation is even the state of our own personal lives. If you've been coming to this church for any period of time, I'm sure you've heard me talk a little bit about the sin that we're each born with. We have this natural inclination just to rebel against God and to do our own thing. And the Bible is very clear saying that the wages of sin is death. We deserve eternal separation, eternal punishment from God because of our sin. But of course, I also told you that God, in his mercy, sent his son, Jesus Christ, to come to the earth, to live a life as a man, a sinless man, never sinning once. And then he died on a cross, and he took our place, took our punishment for our sin, rose again to life 3 days later, and he's alive today, and he's invited all of us to accept and believe in him so that we can have that eternal life and the joy and the peace that he offers. But the problem is that maybe some of us haven't accepted that message. Some of us maybe haven't heeded God's warning that he's given us clearly about our impending destruction. And I know that sounds kind of harsh, but I think that's the reality. Romans 2, verse 5 says, "But because you are stubborn and refuse to turn from your sin, you are storing up terrible punishment for yourself. For a day of anger is coming when God's righteous judgment will be revealed. He will judge everyone according to what they have done. He will give eternal life to those who keep on doing good, seeking after the glory and honor and immortality that God offers. But he will pour out his anger and wrath on those who live for themselves, who refuse to obey the truth and instead live lives of wickedness." Just like how God warned Pharaoh of this imminent famine and the destruction that would come, and gave Pharaoh a chance to escape and even to flourish in that situation, so too God has warned us. God's given us a chance to escape this impending punishment of our sin. And instead we can flourish by accepting God's gift of salvation. And if you've never made that choice to accept God's free gift of salvation, I would urge you to do that today. Choose life over death. That's what Pharaoh did. He believed and he accepted God's warning through Joseph. And then we read in verse 37, it says, "Joseph's suggestions were well received by Pharaoh and his officials. So Pharaoh asked his officials, 'Could we find anyone else like this man so obviously filled with the Spirit of God?' Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'Since God has revealed the meaning of the dreams to you, clearly no one else is as intelligent or wise as you are. You will be in charge of my court, and all my people will take orders from you. Only I, sitting on my throne, will have a rank higher than yours.' Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'I hereby put you in charge of the entire land of Egypt.' Then Pharaoh removed his signet ring from his hand and placed it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in fine linen clothing and hung a gold chain around his neck. When Then he had Joseph ride in the chariot reserved for his second in command. And wherever Joseph went, the command was shouted, "Kneel down." So Pharaoh put Joseph in charge of all of Egypt. And Pharaoh said to him, "I am Pharaoh, but no one will lift a hand or foot in the entire land of Egypt without your approval." Then Pharaoh gave Joseph a new Egyptian name, Zephanath Paneah, and he also gave him a wife whose name was Asenath. She was the daughter of Potiphar, the priest of On. So Joseph took charge of the entire land of Egypt. He was 30 years old when he began serving in the court of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. And when Joseph left Pharaoh's presence, he inspected the entire land of Egypt. And we'll pause it there for today. And what an incredible day that must have been for Joseph. You know, when he woke up that morning, he was a slave, right? In prison, completely forgotten about. But by the time he went to bed that night, he was second in command over all of Egypt. Man, life had completely changed for Joseph. What a difference a day makes. You know, it just goes to show you that life can change in an instant. You know, sometimes God has to work and arrange things for years for everything to just be in the right place. But when that one day comes, one day can change everything. And some of you have experienced that yourselves. You know, we talked about at the beginning about how one day can change everything, whether it's, you know, weddings or car accidents, whether it's births or deaths, getting a job, losing a job, whatever it is. You know, I think we've probably all had those reminders that life can change in an instant. And perhaps in your life, you're feeling a little bit maybe like what Joseph might have been feeling like, you know, being that slave in prison, forgotten about for years. Maybe you feel that way a little bit. Maybe you feel like you're just stuck, like your life is on hold, like you're just in this hopeless holding pattern. You know, maybe you feel like nothing's ever going to change. But I'd encourage you to hold on and to put your confidence in God, because one day can change everything. You know, maybe it's a loved one who isn't walking with the Lord. You know, one day can change everything. Or maybe it's a medical condition that just feels hopeless. You know, one day can change everything. Maybe it's a marriage or a relationship that isn't going so well. Hold on, because one day can change everything. Don't lose hope. Put your confidence in God, because one day can change everything. You know, we were reminded from that passage in Romans earlier that one day Jesus Christ is going to return. He's going to come back to earth to bring his reward to those who faithfully follow him, and he's also coming to bring judgment to those who have rejected him. That's going to be a day that will really change everything. And so I think Joseph, he was ready for his one day that changed everything. Even though he knew that in himself, he had no abilities to interpret these dreams, but he had absolute confidence that God could. And I think we need to do the same. There's no way that we can ever be good enough to stand before God. You know, there's no way that we can earn his favor. But the good news is that we don't have to. Jesus Christ has already done that for us. His strength is made in our weak. What am I trying to say here? When we are weak, then he's strong. When we are unable, he is able. Jesus has done everything for us. We simply need to put our hope, our trust, our confidence in him. His perfect, sinless life is what gives us right standing before God. And so if you've never done that before, then perhaps today for you is a day that will change everything. Perhaps this is the day that you'll exchange your guilt for his forgiveness. Perhaps this will be the day that you exchange your sinfulness for his righteousness. Maybe this will be the day that you're freed from sin and judgment and death and will receive instead eternal life and joy and peace. And if you are interested in that day being today, I would love to talk with you. Come catch me after the service. I'd love to pray with you and just encourage you in that decision, because one day can change everything. You know, as for Joseph, that one day really did change everything. But that wasn't the end of his life. You know, what's interesting is we're reading through this passage through Genesis. We're not even halfway done yet. Joseph spent at this point about 13 years as a slave in Egypt, but he's going to spend another 80 years as second in command in Egypt. So his story's not over. We're going to continue that on next week. But for now, I'm going to have the music team come up if they would, and we're going to sing one last song, and then we'll be dismissed into our week. And who knows, maybe one day we'll change everything this week.